You're listening to How to Stan, the podcast all about both specific fandoms and fandom culture as a whole. For more information about the show and the other show that I do, 17 Karat K-Pop, visit 17karatkpop.weebly.com. You can also go to 17karatkpop.weebly.com/howtostan for more specific information about this podcast. Enjoy the show. Aliens may or may not be real, but the belief in them definitely is. People have dedicated their lives to the work of searching for answers regarding UFO sightings and crashes, regarding alien abduction attempts, and unpacking what that means, and trying to find ways, even using hypnosis, to figure out why certain people claim they were abducted and if they really were. Some even go so far as to worship aliens as messiah-like figures, praise aliens, and view them as ruling over humanity secretly. But whether it seems like a fringe belief or a more mainstream, just general belief in aliens and UFOs and all of that, it's worth looking at because it says a lot about our culture. Why are we into what we are into? Why is pop culture so heavily influenced by this? Would it be so influenced if there was nothing to it? And why are people dedicating their lives to ufology? Is it because of the intrigue, the mystery? Is it because they want to feel like they know something that other humans don't? Or is it the opposite, and it's a sense of humility that we need to respect the aliens that control us and know better? Is it about the sense of belonging that comes from being a part of a group? Or is it the opposite, when it's all about dramatizing and living off of those moments of tension and infighting within the believers' groups? That's what this mini-series as a part of How to Stan is all about. The next few special episodes are going to look at ufology, the study of UFOs, alien believers, their religious groups, their other clubs and activities, their conventions, the whole history really in a condensed way of UFO culture at large, and what it says about fandom culture, because there are a lot of similarities, even though it may not seem like it's your traditional pop culture-based fandom. There's a lot to understand about humanity and what humanity values by looking at these groups of people. So whether you believe their testimonies or not, it's worth trying to learn something from them, and that is what the series sets out to do. This is How to Stan UFO Culture. Part 1. The Characters. Before I get to the timeline of events regarding alien encounters, the evolution of UFO culture, etc., here are some key names that I will be referencing throughout the timeline. First, Bob Lazar. He claims he went to MIT and Caltech, but both schools have no records of him ever going there. He claims he had a job working at Area 51, the United States military base that is top secret and is rumored to be a place where, rather than just work on military drills and other secret military-related projects, they're actually more, the rumor is that they're working on something to do more with alien life, or UFO discovery, something of that nature. And that's exactly the kind of project Bob Lazar claims he was working on for Area 51, a project dealing with building 9 flying saucers through reverse engineering. So taking apart 9 flying saucers and finding a way to put them back together to better understand how they work and how they traveled here. Although he does claim he was working on these classified assignments at the Los Alamos National Lab, they have no record of his employment there. One company did confirm to an investigator into Lazar's past that they had hired Lazar at one point to work at their lab, but when asked for further proof and documentation to send to the investigator, they suddenly clammed up and they've never heard back from them since. Gene Huff, a close friend of Lazar's, tried to insist on the credibility of Lazar in a weird way by basically saying he really would never even think to deceive the public. So of course he's not lying because he would never try to lie to people. Saying, quote, "I mean, he lives in his own world and doesn't care what people think. Bob has no idea who won the Super Bowl last year or the World Series. He's busy doing scientific stuff in Bob Lazar world and would not waste his time perpetuating a lie about UFOs." Unquote. George Knapp is the investigative journalist who got pulled into the UFO world when he was a non-believer but became a bit more of a believer over time, saying, quote, 90% of it is crap, but that 10%, that kernel of truth is there, unquote. And he spent his life trying to understand that 10%. But George Knapp continues to have this, what he views as a burden of the reputation of revealing the truth to the public despite not wanting to, because he told Congress in a hearing that it is hard to be, quote, the UFO guy as if it's tattooed on my butt, Jeremy Corbell is someone who was once mentored by George Knapp. He first got into ufology as a young boy, and then it became his life's passion, his life's mission, to pursue UFOs, alien encounters, and all of the stories surrounding those mysteries. He gained fame for making the local news in LA when he posted a video to YouTube of him interviewing a homeless man who described these encounters he had apparently with UFOs that he conjured up in his mind. Prior to uploading the footage, Corbell rewatched it, and he suddenly saw all these red blips in the background that he had not seen before, proving, he alleges, that this man had actually conjured up the presence of UFOs during their conversation. Bill Nye, yes, Bill Nye the Science Guy, actually ended up calling this BS, and he claimed that this quote-unquote exclusive UFO footage was actually probably just superimposed images of sea monkeys. Corbell eventually admitted after realizing that the red lights had been coming from a parachute team nearby. But Corbell is still a believer in these types of things, saying, quote, "If only one of the millions of sightings throughout history is true, then it's true. Truth is perceived in fragments, and only from different angles of vision." Unquote. Similar to Laser, Corbell claimed he was employed by different people and attended different schools, and those educational and employment records have never been able to be verified. John Lair is someone who Corbell spent 6 years of his life trying to get the film rights to, but after trying to butter him up, it never really worked, and John signed away his life rights to someone else. He gained credibility because he had these aviation industry credentials, and so people thought he knows the skies, he knows aircraft. Why would he lie? How could he lie when he says these UFOs are unlike any aircraft he's ever seen? He believed that aliens and humans were constantly in this negotiation because aliens would give us their technology, and then humans would give them sacrifices, people to abduct. Luis Elizondo ran this U.S. government secret UFO program that cost $22 million. Quote, "I spent my entire life in the shadows, and it was a matter of survival for me. Anonymity and obscurity were my allies. They kept me safe. But being able to have the conversation now with the American people so they can finally know what's really going on, I think it's a great privilege and honor for me. I didn't do this so I could be vindicated. I took on an oath decades ago to defend my country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And my oath is to the American people, and the American people deserve the truth. I'm not doing this other than to have a conversation with the American people." Unquote. The History Channel series called Unidentified focused on him coaxing these UFO encounters out of members of the military who had previously been, he views as too stigmatized and shy to come out about their UFO experiences. Some of the stories featured in the series had been debunked long before the show aired, but they were still portrayed as truth, like the story of this UFO sighting in Chile in 2014 that had been proven to have been an airliner. The series includes this conversation with Lieutenant Ryan Graves, who claims he saw all these cube-like things suspended in the air that looked unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen before, and he said what was super unusual is that they were just suspended in the air very still, so the wind was not affecting them whatsoever, which is unusual. Luis joined the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, which we will talk more about in a minute, and when he did, he spoke at a press conference about how this group, TTSA, was trying to transform into not just making media content and exposing these encounters, but researching them and developing what he called alien technology as well. But again, his credibility came into question when one of the images shown during his presentation was of this UFO footage that had already been confirmed to have just been a birthday balloon from England. Tom DeLonge is a former member of the band Blink-182, but he left the group to dedicate his life to becoming a, quote, UFO evangelist. He used to post a lot of conspiratorial views on his website Strange Times, but that site has since been shut down. He co-wrote a book about the Roswell incident, which we will talk about in a bit, and the aliens who he thinks caused it. This book intentionally blended fictional and non-fictional elements of the incident, which didn't do much for his credibility. It's called Chasing Shadows, and it's over 700 pages long. He has been UFO hunting. He's also been hunting for Bigfoot. He even, when he was part of the band, released a song called Aliens Exist. He also believes the Cold War was never a hot war, as he calls it, because the countries were in a secret pact with aliens to protect the Earth from the consequences of a hot war, the nuclear destruction that it might have caused or something like that. That there was just this implicit contract between aliens and humanity to not wreck the planet with a hot war. He did this lengthy podcast interview with Joe Rogan once where he basically disavowed who he was formerly, but still holds very tight to his beliefs in aliens and the like. He believes he had his own encounter with an alien while he was camping in California, and he remembers this gap in his memory from that night, which he thinks are the hours where he was being abducted. He founded the TTSA. He said, quote, "I think of the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences in a similar situation to Google when the internet first started to come out to the public. With the internet, you had something that was poorly understood by the public at large. Everyone who felt part of its creation knew that the potential of this thing was completely groundbreaking and would affect our world for the future as far as they could see," unquote. Because TTSA is a for-profit organization, it has to have SEC monitors, and an SEC report that was filed in 2019 revealed that TTSA is in some serious debt. Yet TTSA actually has been very influential. Pretty soon DeLonge's networking had gotten so successful that he was invited to meet with NASA, and that was followed by 2 days of voluntary testimony he gave to San Diego government officials about possible presences of UFOs and the like. There was also an interesting time where these suspicious pieces of metal were found, and DeLonge claimed they were evidence of a crashed UFO. It started where a man claims that after this crash in New Mexico of a spaceship, he picked up the metal and kept it, and eventually his grandson got it and gave it to Art Bell, a conspiratorial radio host. Then it went from Art Bell to Linda Howe, a ufologist and journalist. Then it was purchased by DeLonge. He declared that they were made of a material that had to have come from outside of the Earth. It was just not a material that we see here on Earth. DeLonge says he had those pieces sent to Dr. Harold Puthoff for testing, and there was never really a follow-up. As of recording time, there still hasn't been about what happened when they were tested. He never got back to the public about that. There are full societies that are a bit like a religion that worship alien life, or at least appreciate it at a higher level than most would expect. Like the Aetherius Society, which mixes Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian beliefs, along with spiritual wellness philosophies for life and spiritual practices, yoga, things like that. They put a lot of stake into. The goal of the Aetherius Society is to prevent the end of the world by improving alien-human relations. And that's what a lot of these religious-type groups view their goal as a religion, is they believe that they mix beliefs from different religions as well as just spiritual and the wellness community mottos and ways of life, mixed with the need to have a good energy in the world in order to keep this peace and strengthen alien-human relationships, because they believe aliens are trying to tell humans something. They warn about this upcoming apocalypse if we don't heed their calls, better protect the Earth, and better protect each other. This group is specific in not those beliefs, but in the fact that they view their goal as charging these spiritual energy batteries through prayers and meditation. They believe that one day, who they call the next master, is going to descend upon the Earth, and your ultimate goal in life is to become a master. Aliens haven't visited Earth yet, they claim, because we are still not on the same vibratory rate and spiritual level. They view humans, as some of the other similar religious-like groups view aliens, as having this superior status, and humans are this backwards evolution. So ideally, you need to strive to be more and more like an alien, which is viewed as the true best form. There also is an enemy in their story. The Aetherius Society believes this group, called the Silence Group, is keeping silent about alien life from humans and trying to prevent that information from being public knowledge. This group was created by George King in 1954 when he claims that he suddenly heard a voice who told him he was set to be the next voice for interplanetary parliament. And then he says after that one message struck him, he started to get routine telepathic messages. And he also claimed he suddenly learned to speak every single language. George King believed not so much in the upcoming apocalypse as other members of this group, because he spent more of his time focused on what was on the other side, which is another side of this. While some of these religious groups, whether they're about aliens or not, have these apocalyptic fears. Others have less of a doomsday view and just focus on this utopia that humanity they believe will enter after that apocalypse. Only the people who are morally good will survive the apocalypse, and then they will have all of these joys and rewards on the other side. George King led some of his followers on this Operation Starlight twice, in 1958 and 1961, where they basically climbed up mountains so that they could charge those mountains, add spiritual energy batteries to those mountain sites. They continued to want to push for more spiritual energy batteries that are charged throughout the earth so that aliens know we have the right vibratory rate for them to come down here and improve relations with us or save us. Then there's the Unarius Society, which was founded by Ruth and Ernest Norman in the late 60s. Believers say that Ruth is this spiritual being who can reveal to them all these hints about who they were in past lives. This Academy of Science was founded in 1954 as this nonprofit seeking to offer, quote, a comprehensive curriculum of self-mastery, the joining of science and spirit, unquote. The joining of science and spirit pretty much sums up the appeal of these groups and these societies, as they call themselves, because they viewed themselves as finding a way to take science and the facts and the credibility that comes with being into aerospace or being into just the solar system in general, and those truly rooted in facts, verifiable concepts, and mixing that knowledge and then the credibility you get from that knowledge with the things that you can't pin down and have concrete proof of, spiritual and religious beliefs. And the merging of science and spirit is really what has led people to want to dedicate their lives to this, because there are always more layers to unravel, more questions to have answered, building off of your prior knowledge and experiences. A quick overview of the kind of alien encounters you're going to hear about in the timeline. A lot of them have a lot of similarities. They all describe having this encounter with aliens when they black out for a period of time, and that is viewed as the time they were abducted. And then a lot of them do not even remember being abducted or whatever happened during those hours until they are put under hypnosis. And then they recall the aliens taking them into their ship and often poking and prodding them and trying to take DNA from them or find a way to just learn about the human body and what they can take. A lot of them recount these aliens having a very specific look that became known as the Gray, which was viewed as this creature that came towards them, these cat-like features and claws and this small stature, and often shoulder-length hair, and they wore often this jumpsuit-type outfit. That's what people remember. Bud Hopkins largely gets credit for normalizing the look of the Gray in culture and in people's memories, really, and that is viewed as like a stereotypical alien now, thanks to these UFO circles that have picked up on his description. Hopkins defined this concept of missing time, which is what he described as that blackout period that you don't remember what happened during until hypnosis. He posited that any time someone has a blank space in their memory, aliens could be attributed to it. It doesn't have to be flat out, just blacked out, but anything that happens, like when you go on a long drive and then you go home and you have that feeling of you don't remember the drive home at all. Any of those moments where you realize you weren't really paying attention at all and you feel like you almost were blacked out or just mentally somewhere totally different. Hopkins said whenever that's the case, there's a possibility it was because of an alien encounter that they then wipe humans' memory of. He wrote about this woman, Virginia Horton, who is the first case he ever heard about of a person being visited by aliens more than once. And that led him to a hypothesis that was new in UFO circles at the time, that aliens were not actually just randomly picking humans to learn from, at like science experiments, but that they would intentionally target some people over and over. However, Hopkins he viewed them as not being so sadistic, just apathetic to any pain they actually caused physically during their examinations. And sometimes there were physical signs that the aliens had attacked, like people with burn marks or people with nosebleeds. That often Hopkins attributed to unexpected nosebleeds being due to an alien putting a probe up someone's nostril, all to collect humans' genetic info and learn from it. Hopkins also had a positive view of aliens just in the sense that some people were just always scared of those encounters and viewed them as a worst nightmare. But he viewed it as, your first encounter will be scary, but your follow-up encounters should be positive. However, he definitely still had a more negative view of aliens than some. Like there's this guy, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who viewed aliens as cosmic citizens. That's what he called them, cosmic citizens, who were just trying to learn about Earth and improve our life here. He hosted a UFO conference every year about those teachings. So that is typically what happens, but there also is such a broader variety too. It's not just the gray that some people remember seeing, which is part of the continued appeal of this, because there's no one clear description, and therefore there are lots of mysteries that can still be solved. In 1896, a strange light was seen over Sacramento, California, and the actual source was never found. It was thought to be airships, but no one ever knew. People were intrigued by the story, not so much by the actual structure they saw, but by not knowing who made it and where it had come from. 1938 was the infamous War of the Worlds novel being broadcast on the radio, and during that reading, people took it seriously. They were running around outside in a panic, thinking that an alien invasion was imminent. This just goes to show that right from the beginning, when aliens were a part of just knowledge that it was a thing whether you believed in it or not, once it was a topic of conversation in America, it started out in a very scary light. So the fear of the influence of aliens and alien life was stoked in the 1930s. And then a lot of speculation and concern around UFOs and aliens rose during World War II and after it, because members of both sides of the war worried that any sign of a mysterious light or something similar they saw from the other side, which they started nicknaming Foo Fighters, they assumed those red lights they saw were just weapons being used by the other side. No official origin of those lights, though, was ever clarified, which just added to the concern. Another historic day in UFO and alien believer circles was the Roswell incident of 1947. The Roswell Army Airfield in New Mexico was the site of an aircraft crash. What led to intrigue was not so much what happened, but the aftermath, because the military seemed to change their stance, which left people suspicious. Their stance changed from saying it was a flying saucer to brushing it off as just a weather balloon. Eventually, it would be confirmed to have been not a flying saucer, but a weather balloon, but by the next year, 300 more sightings had been officially reported of some sort of flying saucer. So the government's original stance did have an impact. This incident was credited with normalizing the term flying saucer for the first time because of what it looked like when they saw that UFO. And eventually it just became more common to say UFO instead of flying saucer. It actually didn't look super similar to a saucer. At first it was reported as looking saucer-shaped, and that name just stuck. The following year, the U.S. Air Force started a mission called Project Sign, which eventually got rebranded to Project Grudge, and it basically was set out to investigate UFOs that were possibly Soviet aircraft. The Air Force released a report on potential UFO sightings in December of 1948, and it was revealed to actually have been sightings of Soviet Union weapons. In the early 1950s were the first claims not just of UFO sightings, but now also claims of alien abductions. Also in the 1950s, in New Mexico, a lot of crash dummies were seen falling from the sky. These were later called dummy drops, and people were freaking out, thinking again it was an alien invasion of sorts, but actually it was revealed to be an experiment done by the Air Force, while they were experimenting with different techniques for pilots to fall and not die. Yet the level of suspicion about the true motives of alien sightings that skepticism was kept alive throughout the 50s when all of these UFO-themed movies were popular, like Earth versus the Flying Saucers, Invasion of the Saucer Men, and The Day the Earth Stood Still. There were several Area 51 sightings at Area 51 throughout the 50s and 60s, and this was this location for a Cold War program that sought to create this undetectable spy plane. The program was called Oxcart. Believers think planes like this are built in Area 51 using aliens as the test dummies, like the ones that fell from the sky. In the summer of 1952, a series of sightings in Washington, D.C. led to the CIA setting up a new investigative panel. After the project came to a close in 1953, they reached the conclusion that 90% of the sightings could be attributed to some sort of meteorological circumstance and not actual aliens or anything. So there was no clear and current security threat to America, and they also said there was no clear evidence to support the ETH, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. But the speculation persisted because they said 90%, and people were wondering, what about the other 10% of accounts that you cannot back up with evidence regarding it was just something astronomical. Suspicions also remained because parts of this report were kept sealed for a very long time. In 1952 as well, this true story was written by George Adamski and Desmond Leslie, called Flying Saucers Have Landed, where George claimed to have interacted with some friendly aliens from Venus, Mars, and Jupiter. He claims they communicated via hand signals because these aliens did not speak English, and they had to sign affidavits because the aliens told them to. This happened after they had spent the day in the California desert, which would become a notable, frequent site for alien believers to travel to in the hopes of seeing their own aliens. George wrote a follow-up book as well called Inside the Spaceships, and he talked about all these different Martians that he interacted with, and then eventually gave names and either taught English or they just somehow learned English from someone else by that point. He then claims after he gained aliens' trust, he was invited onto the motherboard and was told that he too could reign over the cosmos just like them if only he learned to better love people. In 1952 as well, George von Tassel, an airplane mechanic, had his first experience with aliens. He says they warned him about the coming apocalypse followed by some sort of utopia. He was told to build this thing called the Integratron. And the Integratron was this building that was supposed to also serve as some sort of time machine of sorts, where if humans walked through it, they would reverse age. It became his life's work to build this reverse aging machine, and it was actually almost done. After 20 years of working on it, when he died of a heart attack before he could see that happen. This wasn't some sort of grift either. It's not like he started some sort of GoFundMe equivalent. He'd done it with his own money, earned from hosting his own UFO-themed conventions, and he also ran a newsletter that brought in some income as well. The conventions have been quite popular. Estimates vary, but about 10,000 to 11,000 people at times were attending. August of 1952, Sonny Desvergers burst out of this grove in South Florida. He was burned and mumbling, and he said he had just crossed paths with this UFO, and now he could barely see. He had lost his sight after this encounter. He says he lost consciousness after he suddenly felt the presence of a UFO above him. A deputy interviewed him for this investigation called Project Blue Book, and the deputy said, quote, "In all my 19 years of law enforcement work, I've never seen anyone as terrified as he was," unquote. The co-founder of the ICCRA, the Crop Circle Researchers Association, was Jeffrey Wilson. Wilson was one of the people who studied the soil and the grass samples from this area where alleged abduction took place. And they did verify he had those injuries. He was burned. He did have problems seeing. He was mumbling, and something was very wrong with whatever happened to him physically. So they studied soil and grass samples from that area where the UFO allegedly landed, and they were all shocked to see that the roots were charred in the ground. They couldn't recreate that effect in the soil and the roots of a plant. They tried everything to see if they could recreate it in a lab to see what would have caused it. And the only thing that would happen that would cause that is they tried to put clumps of grass into a pan and heat them up to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. But nothing else would have done that. Wilson had always observed in the past that when grass is singed like that, it's always above the soil and never just like charred to the root. It was just a sight that they had never seen before. In March of 1954, George King in London, he was at home doing the dishes, and suddenly he was interrupted by that voice of Interplanetary Parliament, who told him that he could become the next voice of Interplanetary Parliament, and that following year is when he founded the Aetherius Society. That same year that society was founded was when the earliest test site was officially acknowledged and photographed for the first time. That Area 51 test site. But that base disappeared from maps years later, and the government seemed to act like it had never been on the map at all. Project Blue Book took place from 1952 to 1969, and it compiled information from over 12,000 reported sightings. The project concluded that only 6% of cases could be considered totally unidentified, and all of the rest were thrown into a category called identified, with a known astronomical, atmospheric, or artificial phenomenon. So human-caused incident, as opposed to something they didn't think was human-caused and they didn't know what would have caused it. This project also seemingly debunked Betty and Barney's story. We'll talk about them later. Although one of the science advisors on this project found Betty and Barney very credible when he interviewed them. The report findings did not really tie up many loose ends for people. In 1959, Howard Menger claimed that he had had an experience with an alien abduction, and he remembered what the female alien looked like in vivid detail. He described her to the illustrator who put her on the cover of From Outer Space to You. He said, quote, "She seemed to radiate and glow as she sat on the rock, and I wondered if it were due to the unusual quality of the material she philosophically wore, which had a shimmering, shiny texture surpassing the sheen of nylon. The clothing fasteners or seams I could discern. She wore not unlike, but far had no buttons, no makeup, which would have been unnecessary to the fragile transparency of her Camilla-like skin with pinkish undertones." Unquote. 1960, Gabriel Green ran for president because he said his alien space brothers told him to do so. Needless to say, he did not win. September 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were traveling back from a Canada vacation back to their home in New Hampshire when they had their own scary encounter. Betty thought she saw this white star, this beam of light that was following their car. And so at first it was just curious, but then it got scary as it kept following and following. To learn more, they pulled the car over to the side of the road, and Barney took out his binoculars that he had with him. He says he saw not necessarily just a UFO, but creatures. They looked like living beings in these black uniforms of sorts. Although they didn't remember anything else happening to them, they just remember getting out unscathed. That was not really the case, because Betty started having a recurring nightmare about that night. So she wanted to seek help, and she started visiting with a psychiatrist, who put her under hypnosis, and only then after she had been put under hypnosis did she remember, oh my gosh, I was abducted by aliens, and she was able to recount that experience. When put under hypnosis, Barney also was able to do this, but his account varied a bit. There were a lot of little details that were not the same as the recollections that Betty had. However, the doctor obviously found them persuasive in their memories and co-wrote a book with them, called The Interrupted Journey, 2 Lost Hours Aboard a Flying Saucer. In November of 1963, 4 witnesses in Sandling Park in England saw a flying saucer, and then they claimed that they saw all these, quote, human-sized black figures, headless, with webbed feet and wings like a bat, unquote. In 1962, a comic came out called There Are Martians Among Us, which had this big plot twist in this fictional story where a couple was worried about this impending alien invasion and trying to figure out where the evil aliens were, and then at the end they realized they've been the aliens the whole time. I mentioned the detail about this comic just because it's symbolic of a lot of the pop culture. It was framing these alien encounters as not only believable, but as something to be very afraid of. In August 1964, Bud Hopkins and his 2 friends in Cape Cod, they were on this trip together when they saw what he describes as a darkish elliptical object that was about the length of 2 cars. And that was ultimately the encounter that provoked his deep interest in spotting UFOs and learning more about them. In 1965, Betty and Barney's experience got newspaper coverage at last. It had taken years for unclear reasons, but then suddenly the media buzz changed the course of their life forever and they became celebrities. In 1966, a couple of big things happened. One was that Howard Miller had this sighting, and he describes it as, quote, "All at once it was daylight, and I looked up to see what happened. There was a light about that big, going up, drifting up the hill. When I looked and seen it just faded out. I've been in the Marines and know what airplane lights look like, and it was too big for that. If there was any such thing as a UFO, that's what that was," unquote. Then the Air Force requested another committee be set up like similar ones that had happened before to investigate new sightings like this one. This was called the Condon Report, named after Edward U. Condon, and it included a panel of 37 scientists looking over 59 reported sightings of UFOs. Project Blue Book's dismantling and overall delegitimizing, discrediting, is in part due to the findings of the Condon Report, which reinforced the thought that there was just not enough evidence to support any ETH, extraterrestrial hypothesis. In 1972, J. Allen Hynek published a book called The UFO Experience, in which he wrote, quote, the insistence on official secrecy and frequent classification of documents was hardly needed since the Pentagon had declared that the problem really didn't exist, unquote. Basically saying that if you have nothing to hide, then why are you hiding and sealing documents? In October 1973, Tennessee residents claimed that they saw a creature with claws who snatched up children, and on the exact same day, a UFO landing was reported, not in Tennessee like that incident, but in Mississippi. A reported sighting from November 1973 came from Florence Dow from New Hampshire, who saw, quote, a black coat and wide-brim hat pulled down over a face that looked as if it had been covered with masking tape, unquote. In 1974, the first of many reports of paranormal activity on Skinwalker Ranch was revealed. This was also called the UFO Ranch or Sherman Ranch. In 1981, Hopkins published the book Missing Time, documented stories of people kidnapped by UFOs and then returned with their memories erased. 1987 was when Walt Andrus, the director of Mutual UFO Network, deemed the largest USA UFO research organization, issued a statement confirming that he had come to the conclusion after years of observations that only 4 types of alien species had visited the Earth, including an experimental animal, a robot, and a human-like humanoid. Hopkins published a hypothesis that same year saying, quote, again, I want to describe the general pattern of these accounts. An individual, male or female, is first abducted as a child, at a time possibly as early as the 3rd year. He then goes on to describe some invasive procedures that the alien would take to get genetic information from the child, and then he says there will often follow a series of contacts or abductions extending through the years of puberty, unquote. March 20th, 1988, John Salter claimed that he and his son had been abducted by several gray humanoids who implanted mind control devices in them. At least that's what he assumed they had done, because suddenly his blood clotting was a lot faster and his eyesight was a lot better, and he didn't know where those physical miracles would have come from if not for an alien encounter. This report was also one of the unusual at the time instances where the physical effect of an alien visit was viewed as positive. 1989, George Knapp contacted Bob Lazar after hearing about Bob Lazar having that insider information about working at Area 51. Like I said before, Lazar claimed he had worked there reverse engineering 9 spacecraft to see how they were made and what they did. Lazar claimed to Knapp that he had built his own UFO like the ones he had been studying, but it couldn't fit a human inside, so he didn't bother showing proof to him because he couldn't show himself off riding in it. Long story short, Bob Lazar definitely dedicated his life to this work. Like, literally, he was at work all the time. It led his wife to assume he was having an affair out every night, and the affair allegations were used as blackmail against him, allegedly by the government, who destroyed some of the documents of existing UFOs he had been creating. A lot of this is hearsay and speculation about who did what, but that affair allegation really did cause harm to him in some way, shape, or form. And during that time, there were also some spats and a lot of fighting between Knapp and Lazar, leading to at one point one of them calling the cops on the other. It's a long story. May of that year, Bob Lazar had his very first TV interview about his experiences, and further showed that he was just passionate about this and truly believed it, and it wasn't about like a money grab or anything, or publicity, because he used a pseudonym, Dennis, and he didn't want to be identified in any way during this interview. November 10th of that year, though, a KLAS TV special aired called UFOs: The Best Evidence, and that is when Bob Lazar officially, for the first time, allowed his true name to be used to identify him. This interview is given credit for kind of mainstreaming the concept of Area 51 into pop culture and social discourse, and that broadcast became the most watched local news program ever produced there. In 1994, the Sherman family moved onto Skinwalker Ranch, and they immediately started feeling and experiencing really scary things. They saw bolts on the windows, doors, and cabinets. They would hear weird noises all the time. They spotted UFOs while they were living there, and they would walk around corners, and all of a sudden they would see that their cattle had been slaughtered. The family eventually sold the ranch to a private research organization. In 1996, UFO theories were gaining a lot of credibility when George Knapp wrote some articles about them, published in the Desert News, a Salt Lake City paper. In 2004 and 2005, U.S. Navy pilots recorded 3 different videos of UFOs from the California and Florida coasts, and those were eventually released, but not for many years. In interesting coincidental timing, in 2004 as well, the National Institute for Discovery Science, which had been observing UFOs, suddenly closed its doors after the pilots got that footage. In 2005, Knapp and Colm Kelleher wrote a book together called Hunt for the Skinwalker: Science Confronts the Unexplained at a Remote Ranch in Utah. These past few years have been full of developments in the world of ufology, where there have been new sightings, politicians have been getting involved and having these big committee hearings about some newly released footage. There was also this big dump of emails in 2016 that led to some interesting revelations about what the government may have known about the possibility of UFOs existing. There's a lot of speculation that is revealed in those leaked emails. We also, of course, have to talk about the Area 51 event that started on Facebook as a joke but turned into an in-person Storm Area 51 event, and all of the drama that ensued with co-creators of the event, the co-organizers of it, who eventually parted ways. There's just a lot of drama and intrigue and twists and turns to get to in the timeline still. That is the timeline of alien and UFO info up until 2016, and that is where we will pick up next week. Thank you all for listening to How to Stand. Tune in next week for part 2 of this series of episodes.